This is a short 7-minute video introduction to 19th century musical nationalism. It is like a mini lecture that you can start, stop, and review as much as you find helpful. It is designed to supplement your assigned reading and listening on the topic of musical nationalism and revolves around the questions: can music be nationalist? How so? Or why not? Nationalism is loyalty to one's nation or cultural group. Cultural nationalism refers to loyalty to ideas associated with a culture that may or may not be defined by political boundaries. Political nationalism is directly related to an established state. Both sorts of nationalism thrived in the 19th century Western world. Early in the 19th century, Napoleon's attempts to conquer all of Europe led the Germans, Italians, and English to celebrate their own folk poetry, stories, and songs, often making traditions up if they couldn't find historical documents for them. Later in the century, the peoples of what are now the Scandinavian, Eastern European, and Southern European countries struggled to define their own cultures and political boundaries against strong German and Austrian rulers and a prevailing Germanic music culture. This screen outlines some of their schools of musical nationalism. This screen lists many of the ways in which nationalist sentiments might be thought to be expressed in music. It is important to note that the texts associated with vocal musics and program musics can play an important role in establishing a piece of music as nationalist or not. It is also important to stress that musical nationalism can range from the very subtle to the quite overt. As you listen to the music discussed in this video, you may want to rank it on a spectrum of 1 to 10, 1 being not very nationalist in sound and 10 being extremely nationalist. Now take a moment to pause the video and think about the ways in which music can be thought to express nationalism. Can you think of an example of each? Nationalism thrived in areas that were perceived as cultural backwaters by the Germans and French, areas such as the United States and Russia. We've already listened to the music of the pianist Louis Gottschalk, which celebrated his American roots. New Englander Edward McDowell's music is quite different in sound. How nationalist do you think his short piano piece, To a Wild Rose, sounds? One American whose music might be thought to be very nationalist is John Philip Sousa. How might the experience of The Stars and Stripes Forever at patriotic events affect one's perception of it? As with most Americans, most 19th century Russians looked to France and Germany for their concert music. But by the end of the 19th century, there emerged a group of Russian composers who became known as the Mighty Handful. They included Mily Balakirev, Alexander Borodin, Cesar Cui, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Modest Mussorgsky. Lacking much formal musical training, they looked to Russian folk songs and scales and set Russian texts. Although he thought of himself as a proud Russian and even wrote music such as the 1812 Overture, conservatory-trained Peter Tchaikovsky was not part of this group. If the music of the Russian Five was considered nationalist within the Russian state, it was considered exotic by many other Europeans. A good example is the coronation scene from Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov from 1874. This historical drama tells the story of Godunov, a man who is named Tsar of Russia, even though he likely murdered the child who was to be heir to the throne. After the murder is made public, a public rebellion ensues, and eventually Godunov is forced from power. Boris Godunov's coronation scene, however, is from the beginning of the opera before his misdeeds are exposed. It incorporates many stereotypically Russian characteristics. For example, it employs church bells in a large orchestra and large chorus. Lower registers, for example the bass vocal range and low brass, are highlighted. The libretto, as one might expect, is in Russian, and the melodic line takes on its unique accentuation. Additional folk markers include the narrow range of the melodic lines and their cyclic tendencies. Cyclic melodies repeatedly return to a home pitch. Notice that although the excerpt uses conventional chords, these chords do not follow the progressions of Western European music. Tonal centers are established by repetition rather than by voice leading. Finally, the entire episode is constructed in sections rather than drawing on an organic development dynamic such as sonata form. Make sure to follow along in your anthology as you listen to the excerpt. To conclude this mini lecture, we turn to music that reflects 19th century nationalism and exoticism, but through musical parody, the operettas of English men W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan. The late 19th century operetta was light-hearted opera that normally included spoken drama rather than recitative. In the hands of Gilbert and Sullivan, operetta became parody, that is, imitation of 19th century operatic conventions for the purpose of comic effect. Furthermore, many of Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta might be thought to go beyond simple parody to satire, satire being parody with a social or political edge. The edge in Gilbert and Sullivan's music may have been fueled by the acrimonious spirit which characterized most of their personal relationship. They literally hated each other as individuals and often had to be persuaded to collaborate on projects. In their music, librettist Gilbert satirized the convoluted plots, exotic locales, and heroic actions of the typical 19th century opera. Composer Arthur Sullivan wrote music that exaggerated the speech-like melodies of dialogue passages, that used repetition without dramatic purpose, and that exploited the musical unity of the ensemble number, which had traditionally brought together characters with the most divergent experiences, neatly wrapping them up into a harmonious musical piece. Your assigned excerpt from The Pirates of Penzance features parody at every turn. Make sure to read about its exotic and conscientious pirates, cowardly policemen, and improbable circumstances. Note how Sullivan has the singers imitate the sounds of trumpets with their voices and express ad nauseum their feelings rather than moving forward with the action. In its final ensemble, the opponents sing together, but not before tracing tonal relationships of a tritone. This screen ends the video on nationalism and exoticism in 19th century music.